Hello everyone and welcome to the first video in this actuarial derivatives pricing. So this is the first video. We're just going over the basic definitions of what a derivative is and then just the definitions of calls, puts and forwards. Alright, let's get into it. So let's start with what is a derivative. So a derivative is basically a contract and between two or more parties. And sort of the value behind it is through an underlying asset, also known as a reference security. So there's many different things this underlying asset could be. For example, it could be gold, it could even be sheep, it could be oil. Yeah, there's a lot of different things it could be, but for our intents and purposes, it will be stocks. So with derivatives, there are a lot of different types of contracts. There are option contracts, forward contracts, future contracts, and swap contracts. But for this video, we'll just be focusing on the first two. So option contracts, calls and puts, and forward contracts. Before we go into the definitions, we'll first go through some distinctions. The first being the buyer versus seller distinction. So the buyer is the one that pays for the contract versus the seller is the one that receives money for the contract. So, since the buyer pays for the contract, they have the right. So they have choice. Whereas the seller receives money for the contract, they have to have the obligation. So they don't really have a choice. So what is right and obligation? As I explained earlier, the right is a choice. So you can do it. And often the consequences of being able to choose is you'll choose the best outcome. Versus if you have an obligation, you have to do it. Therefore, the consequence is you often get given the worst outcome. Now we'll be going into the two main types of option contracts. So that's the call and put options, and we'll go through their definitions. The first is the call option. Obviously, it is a contract, it is a derivative, and here the buyer has the right to exercise their option to buy a stock, and this is at a predetermined price. Well, the seller has the obligation, so they have no choice but to sell the stock if the buyer exercises the option to buy. So in this case, if the buyer chooses to buy the stock, the seller has to sell it to them. Versus if the buyer does not choose to buy the stock, the seller is left with the stock. So why would you want a call option? You'd want to be the buyer of a call option if you speculate prices to increase. Thus, you have the option to buy it. A put option is also a contract and a derivative, but here the buyer, instead of having the right to exercise the option to buy, has the option to sell the stock at the predetermined strike price. The seller has the obligation to buy the stock if the buyer exercises their right to sell. So in essence, if the buyer wants to sell the stock, the seller has to buy it. And if the buyer doesn't want to sell their stock, the seller doesn't have to do anything. So in this case, the buyer is often hedging against price falls. So now we'll be going into forwards. Forwards is, another contract, another derivative, but here you want to buy or sell a stock at a predetermined price. In this case, both parties have obligations. So it's basically saying, in the future, I'm going to buy this stock and you're going to sell this stock to me at this price, no matter what happens. So there's no rights, there's no choices. It's just something that will happen in the future. And it's just often these initial values are set to 0. So it's just a contract between the two. And why would you have a forward in the first place? Well, one party would be speculating prices to increase, while the other would be hedging against price falls. Okay, so there are two types of options that affect the time period. The first is American, the second is European. So American options can be exercised at any time up until time t. So for example, if the time period is 10 years, it can be exercised at 1 year, 2 years, even 2.5 years. Whereas the European option can only be exercised at a particular point in time, time t. So if it's 10 years, it can only be exercised at the 10-year mark and not before or after. Because of this, the American option is often worth more. Okay, so that's it for this first one, just the definitions. The next lesson will just be on the put-call parity as well as some payoff functions.